The fog came first, before anything else could be known of that morning. It moved low across the water of the harbour, thick as wool, carded but not yet spun. It held the colour of old pewter, the colour of a sky that had forgotten what it meant to be blue. Somewhere beneath that grey ceiling, unseen from the quay, the masts of a dozen ships rose into the mist like the bones of some vast and patient creature, waiting. It was the 1880 seconds, though no calendar was needed to know it. The age announced itself in the particular hush of the harbour, in the creak of hemp, and the low murmur of men who spoke the language of sail and salt, a language already beginning, though none of them could have known it, to fade from the world. Among those ships, resting at her anchor, with the quiet stillness of something that has done this many times before, was the bark Caledonia. She sat low in the water, her three masts disappearing upward into the fog until only their suggestion remained, ghostly and indistinct. Her hull was dark, her paint recently renewed along the waterline, though above that fresh black, the wood held the deeper marks of years, the salt-etched grain, the small scars of ice and rope and weather that no coat of paint could entirely erase. Cold? She was not young. Few ships built for this particular trade were young by the time they had earned the right to call themselves Cape Horners. But she was sound and she was ready, and on this grey morning she waited the way old ships wait, with a patience that seemed to belong more to stone than to timber. This was the age of nitrate and wool, when the ports of Europe hungered for what only the far coast of Chile and the pampas beyond could give them, and when a long chain of ships stretched across the world's most punishing waters to satisfy that hunger. The saltpeter came up from the desert mines of the Atacama, packed and shipped from ports with names that meant little to those who had never sailed there. Iquique, Antofagasta, Valparaiso. It travelled north in the holds of ships like Caledonia, bound for the fields of England and Germany, where it would feed crops and fill the barrels of powder that a restless world seemed always to require. And, in exchange, wool came south, and manufactured goods, and men who had signed contracts they barely understood, drawn by wages that promised more than the land ever had. Between these two hungers lay 8,000 miles of ocean, and at the base of that ocean where the Atlantic and the Pacific reached for each other around the tip of a broken continent, there waited Cape Horn. The port itself moved with the unhurried rhythm of a place that had long since made its peace with waiting. Along the quay, chandlers worked in the mist with the methodical calm of men who had loaded 1,000 ships before this one and expected to load 1,000 more. Barrels of salt beef were rolled along worn planking, their staves damp with the harbour's breath. Sacks of hard biscuit were carried aboard in careful stacks, counted and recounted by a mate with a ledger balanced against his forearm. Coils of new rope, still pale and unweathered, were passed hand to hand up the gangway, destined to replace what the sea would inevitably claim before the voyage's end. Nothing about this loading suggested urgency. It was ritual, performed with the unspoken understanding that haste at the beginning of a voyage such as this one was its own kind of danger, that a ship provisioned carelessly in port might starve her crew before she rounded the Horn. Dock hands moved along the wharf-coiling lines with hands that had long since lost any tenderness to blister or rope burn. Their palms turned to something closer to leather than skin. They spoke little, and when they did speak, it was in the clipped shorthand of men who had said the same words about the same tasks so many times that whole sentences had worn down to a handful of syllables. Somewhere behind them, muffled by the fog, until it seemed to come from very far away, a harbour bell tolled its slow, unhurried rhythm, marking a time that mattered more to the tides than to any clock. The sound rolled out across the water, softened and rounded by the mist, and then faded again into the grey hush that had swallowed almost everything that morning except the shapes of ships and the quiet motion of men going about the business of departure. Caledonia herself, seen up close along her waterline, where a small boat drifted past with a final load of stores, revealed the particular character that only a working ship acquires after years upon years of ocean. Her hull, freshly painted black for this voyage, still showed the ghost of old repairs beneath the new coat, faint seams where damaged planking had been replaced, where the carpenter's careful hand had matched grain to grain as closely as the material allowed. Her figurehead, weathered pale by sun and salt, stared forward into the mist with an expression that might have been resolve or might simply have been the blank patience of old wood. Above her, rigging rose in its complex and orderly geometry, shrouds and stays holding the mast steady, yards crossed and squared, the great expanse of furled canvas waiting in tight rolls along each spar, ready to be shaken loose into the wind once open water called for it. Every line, every block, every length of chain had been inspected in the weeks before departure, checked and rechecked, by hands that understood precisely what failure at sea would mean. This was not a ship dressed for show. She was dressed for survival, in the particular sense that word carried among men who sailed south toward the bottom of the world. Her name had been repainted along the bow only days before, the letters crisp and gold against the black hull, not yet touched by salt spray or the slow bleaching of sun. There was something quietly moving in that freshness, in the way new paint sat upon old wood, as though the ship herself were being offered one more chance at newness, before she surrendered again to the wear that the ocean always demanded. Sailors passing along the wharf sometimes paused to look at that name, not from any special reverence, but from the simple habit of men who spent their lives reading the identities of ships, the way others might read the faces of strangers, searching for some sign of what lay ahead. And what lay ahead, though no one aboard spoke of it directly on this quiet morning, was understood by every man who had signed articles for this particular voyage. Cape Horn held the reputation among sailing men that required no exaggeration, for the plain truth of it was already terrible enough. It was said, in the quiet way that sailors said such things, without theatre, without embellishment, that the Horn took what it wanted and returned what it chose. Ships that rounded it successfully often did so only after weeks of battling headwinds so relentless that a vessel might sail forward and be driven back again, gaining perhaps 30 miles in a day, only to lose 40 the next. Ice appeared without warning in these latitudes, drifting silently out of the fog on currents that no chart could fully predict. Waves grew larger here than almost anywhere else on Earth, shaped by the unbroken sweep of ocean that circled endlessly around the bottom of the world, gathering strength across thousands of miles with nothing to slow them until they met the narrow funnel of water between Tierra del Fuego and the ice fields further south. Men who had rounded the Horn before spoke of it, when they spoke of it at all, with a particular restraint, not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present in memory, but something closer to respect, the kind of respect one offers to something that has proven again and again that it does not care whether you survive it or not. It was not spoken of as a monster, for monsters implied intention, and the Horn intended nothing. It simply was what it was, an accumulation of wind and current and cold and distance indifferent to the ambitions of nitrate merchants in Hamburg or wool buyers in Liverpool, indifferent to the wages a man had been promised, or the family waiting for him in some quiet port he might never see again. Ships vanished here, and men vanished with them, and their disappearance was recorded in insurance ledgers and harbour logs with the same flat, unemotional language used to record a late delivery or a damaged cargo. This was simply understood to be the price of the trade, the toll exacted by geography upon ambition, and every man walking the deck of Caledonia that grey morning understood it in his own private way, whether he spoke of it or not. And yet, on this particular morning, there was no sense of dread aboard her. There was only the ordinary business of departure, the quiet competence of men preparing for a voyage they had prepared for many times before. The fog would lift as fog always did, and the harbour bell would fade behind them, and Caledonia would slip her moorings and turn her bow toward open water, carrying with her the particular hope that accompanies every ship setting out, the hope, unspoken but universal, that this voyage, unlike some others, would end quietly, without incident. In some far port where the name freshly painted upon her bow would still be legible, still be whole. For now, though, she rested at anchor beneath that colourless sky, patient as the fog itself, waiting for the tide and the hour that would call her forward into the long grey work of the voyage ahead. If you find comfort in stories such as this one, slow, quiet chronicles of ships and the water that shaped them, you are welcome to stay a while longer, to settle into the telling, and perhaps in time to return again for the voyages. The man who would carry her south was by that hour already awake in the small chart room behind the wheelhouse, a lantern turned low beside him, his coat still damp from an earlier turn about the deck. Captain Alistair Ross was not a man who drew attention in a harbour crowded with taller tales and louder reputations. He was of middling height, thick through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent decades hauling on wet rope, with a face weathered to the colour and texture of old teak, and eyes that had long since stopped widening at anything the sea might show him. He had rounded the Horn 11 times before this voyage, in vessels large and small, in seasons kind and cruel, and in each crossing he had brought his ship and his men home again, not through daring, but through something quieter and in the trade far more valuable, patience. He was known among the shipping agents and the harbour masters, among the old salts who gathered in the taverns near the docks, as a captain who did not chase glory in bad water. He shortened sail before other men would think to, held his course a point wider than pride might suggest, and never mistook boldness for skill. There is an old saying among deep-water sailors, murmured more than declared, that the sea forgives caution far more readily than it forgives ambition, and Ross seemed to have absorbed this truth into the very marrow of his bones. Sailors spoke of him without embellishment, which was, in its own way, the highest praise the trade could offer. He was not a man who inspired ballads. He was a man other men wanted beside them, when the water turned to something other than water, when the wind stopped behaving as wind and became something closer to a living, malevolent thing. Trust in that world was worth more than charisma, and Ross had earned his trust the slow way, voyage after voyage, decision after careful decision, until his name on a manifest was, in the eyes of underwriters and old sailors alike, a kind of quiet insurance policy against the worst the ocean could offer. Beside him, in the small hierarchy of command, stood his first mate, a rangy, sharp-eyed man named Thomas Jarrick, though the men more often simply called him Garrick, dropping the formalities the sea rarely had patience for. Garrick had sailed with Ross for the better part of 6 years, first as a junior officer and now as the captain's most trusted set of eyes and ears aboard the ship. Where Ross was economical with words, offering only what was necessary and no more, Garrick carried a dry, watchful humour that surfaced rarely but was treasured by the crew when it did, a small release valve for tension in an otherwise taut and disciplined ship. He knew the rigging as he knew his own hands, could read the barometer's slow crawl with the same fluency another man might read a newspaper, and had more than once caught some small failing in gear or knot before it became a crisis. Between the captain and his mate, there existed the kind of unspoken understanding that only develops through shared danger. a language of glances and small nods that needed no elaboration, forged across previous crossings when the wind had turned foul. Further down, the ship's modest hierarchy was a young man named Edwin Hale, barely 18, on his first deep-sea voyage, and his first attempt, however unwitting, at the Horn. He had signed aboard in Cardiff with the wide, unshaped hunger of youth, drawn less by the specifics of the voyage than by the general romance of departure itself, the idea of the sea, rather than its lived reality. He had never before been out of sight of land for more than a day, had never felt the particular loneliness of open ocean stretching flat and endless on every horizon, had never known the coal that worked its way beneath oilskins and wool until it seemed to live in the bone itself. The older hands regarded him with the weary, affectionate patience old sailors often extend toward the young. Not unkindness, but a kind of resigned foreknowledge, for they had each once stood where he stood, wide-eyed and unprepared for what the deep water asks of a man. Garrick had taken it upon himself, in the quiet way of experienced officers, to correct the boy's grip on unfamiliar lines, to show him twice over how a knot must be tied, so it will not fail when fingers are numb and the deck is heaving beneath them. Hale absorbed these lessons with the eager seriousness of someone who sensed, without yet fully understanding, that his life might one day depend upon them. Then there was Cook, as the crew simply called him, a heavy-set, superstitious man named Alfred Doyle, who had spent more years at sea than he could easily count, and had accumulated in that time a private cosmology of omens and portents that governed his every action in the galley. He would not permit whistling below decks, for whistling was said to summon wind beyond what a ship could bear. He watched the behavior of gulls trailing the ship with the seriousness other men reserved for scripture, reading in their flight patterns warnings the rest of the crew were only half inclined to credit and yet never quite dismissed outright. Said, on the morning of departure, Doyle had thrown a small offering of bread into the harbour water, an old habit, he claimed, that his own father had taught him on the Baltic runs of his youth, though no one aboard could say whether the tradition was genuine folklore or Doyle's own private invention grown convincing through repetition. The crew tolerated his superstitions with the same mixture of amusement and quiet respect they extended to all such rituals of the sea, for in a trade where death arrived without warning and without evident cause, a man's private magic, however unproven, was his own business and rarely worth mocking aloud. The ship herself carried in her hold several hundred tons of Welsh coal, dense and black, and carefully trimmed to keep her balanced through the long southward run. This was the outbound cargo, unglamorous but essential, coal to fuel the industries and steamships of the Pacific coast, where such fuel commanded prices that made the long and dangerous voyage worth the owner's calculated risk. On the return leg, once the coal had been unloaded in Valparaiso or further north, she would take on nitrate, the pale mineral dust mined from the high desert interior of Chile, prized across the Atlantic world as fertilizer and as raw material for the manufacture of explosives. A commodity whose value had only grown as European agriculture and European wars both hungered for its particular chemistry. The economics of the voyage were in their quiet way as vast as the ocean. The ship was about to cross. Shipping companies, insurers, and merchants in 3 or 4 countries had capital riding on this single hull, returning intact, on this single captain making the right decisions in the wrong weather, on this single crew surviving what the passage south so often took from lesser prepared ships. It was in the ordinary calculus of the age, simply business. Coal down, nitrate back, profit realized on both legs if fortune and skill held steady. But it was also, beneath that dry economic surface, a wager against the Horn itself, against a stretch of ocean that had already claimed, by conservative estimate, thousands of vessels and untold thousands of lives across the centuries of sail. In the days before departure, the crew moved through their preparations with the unhurried thoroughness of men who understood, at some level rarely spoken aloud, that thoroughness now might mean survival later. Rigging was checked and rechecked, each line inspected for fraying, each block examined for stiffness or wear. For a rope that failed in calm water was a minor inconvenience, but a rope that failed in the grey fury south of the Horn could cost a man his life in the time it took to draw breath. Sailmakers went over the canvas with careful hands, patching small weaknesses invisible to less experienced eyes. Below decks, stores were lashed and secured against the violent motion everyone aboard knew was coming, though none could yet say precisely when or how severe it would prove to be. Some of the older hands, in the quiet hours before the tide, could be seen standing alone at the rail, lips moving in silent prayer, addressed to whatever god or fate they privately trusted to watch over them in water where human skill alone was known to be insufficient. Others wrote brief letters home, pressed into the hands of dockside agents who promised, for a small fee, to see them posted. Simple notes to wives and mothers and sweethearts, containing little of substance beyond reassurance and the ordinary, aching hope of men who wished to be remembered kindly should the worst come to pass. Hale, the young apprentice, wrote such a letter to his mother in a careful schoolboy hand, saying little of the voyage's dangers, for he did not yet fully understand them, and saying much instead of his pride at having signed aboard a respectable ship under a respected captain, a pride that was, in its unearned innocence, entirely genuine. Beneath the practical business of preparation ran a quieter emotional current, one the men rarely spoke of directly, but which nonetheless shaped every gesture and glance in those final days at anchor. There was pride, certainly pride in the ship herself, freshly provisioned and sound of timber, pride in a captain whose reputation offered some measure of comfort against the unknown ahead. There was apprehension too, an unspoken awareness among even the most seasoned hands that the Horn cared nothing for, reputation that it had swallowed careful captains and careless ones alike with equal indifferent hunger. And beneath both pride and apprehension ran the simple ordinary hopes, common to men embarking on any uncertain journey, hopes of a swift and profitable passage, of letters awaiting them in Valparaiso, of wages earned and safely delivered home, of an uneventful return to familiar harbours, where wives and children and the small comforts of shore life still waited, unaware of how thin, in truth, the margin between departure and disaster could sometimes prove to be. It was in this mingled atmosphere of quiet preparation and unspoken dread that the final hours before departure slipped past, the crew moving about their tasks with the practiced calm of men who had learned, each in his own way, that the sea rewarded neither panic nor bravado. Careful readiness that Captain Ross himself embodied so completely, the morning the Caledonia slipped her moorings was so still that the harbour seemed to be holding its breath along with her. The water lay flat and pewter-coloured beneath a sky not yet decided on its weather, and the only sound as the lines came free was the soft creak of hemp against wood, the low murmur of men who had said their private goodbyes hours before and now had nothing left to do but work. There was no crowd to see them off, no band playing on the quay. Only a handful of dock workers pausing in their own labour to watch the ship ease backward from her berth, and perhaps one or two wives standing farther back among the warehouses, arms crossed against the morning chill, their faces unreadable at that distance. The shoreline began to recede in that pale, diffused light, peculiar to harbour mornings, the buildings and cranes and church steeples softening into a grey smudge that would, within the hour, be nothing more than a memory of a place rather than the place itself. Captain Ross stood near the wheel with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the operation with the same unhurried attention he brought to every task, large and small. He said little. He rarely did, in these early hours. There would be time enough later for orders and corrections, for the small adjustments that turned a collection of individual sailors into a single working organism. For now, he simply watched and let the ship find her own rhythm as she nosed out past the breakwater and into open water, where the swells, gentle as they were, began at last to lift and settle beneath her keel in that motion sailors call, without much sentiment, the ship coming alive. By midday, the Caledonia had cleared the last visible markers of land, and the crew, many of whom had spent the final nights ashore in taverns or in the arms of family, began to settle into the particular lethargy that follows a hard departure. There is always a kind of exhaustion in leaving, even when the leaving is calm, even when the sea offers no resistance. The body remembers the tension of preparation long after the mind has released it, and so the first day at sea is rarely one of great labor. Sails were trimmed, lines coiled, the galley fire lit for the first proper meal of the voyage, and the ship settled into the long, patient work of simply moving forward. The days that followed were, by any sailor's account, as fine as the Atlantic could offer. The trade winds picked up steadily from the northeast, filling the canvas with a low, constant hum that became, within a week, so familiar a sound that the men ceased to hear it at all, the way one ceases to hear one's own breathing. The Caledonia made good time, her bow cutting a clean line through swells that rarely exceeded a few feet, the horizon holding steady in every direction, blue meeting blue, in a seam so faint it seemed almost apologetic. Flying fish occasionally leapt across the deck in the early mornings, provoking small bursts of laughter from the younger hands, who gathered them up for the cook with the pride of men who had accomplished something significant. Dolphins rode the bow wave some afternoons, and more than one sailor paused his work simply to watch them, finding in their easy, effortless movement through the water a kind of reassurance that the sea, at least for now, was in a generous mood. The rhythm of shipboard life asserted itself quickly, as it always does. Watches were kept in their 4-hour rotations, the bell marking each half hour with a fidelity that made the passage of time feel almost ceremonial. Men slept in their hammocks below, swaying gently with the roll of the ship, waking to the call of the boatswain or the change in light through the hatch above. Meals were taken in shifts in the low-ceilinged mess, where the talk was of small things. A woman left behind, a debt owed, a joke repeated for the 3rd time that week and still finding an audience. The food in these early days was still fresh enough to be enjoyed rather than merely endured. Salt pork, yes, but also the last of the harbor's bread before it turned hard. Potatoes that had not yet begun to sprout in their barrels. Tea sweetened generously because no one had yet begun rationing anything. In the evenings, when the work permitted it, there was singing. It came, as it always does at sea, not from any formal arrangement, but from the rhythm of labor itself. A man hauling on a line would begin a verse, half muttered at first, and by the second line others would join, their voices falling into the same cadence as their pulling, so that song and work became a single motion indistinguishable from one another. The older hands sang the songs they had always sung. The ones whose origins no one could quite remember, passed down from ship to ship and crew to crew until they belonged to no one and everyone at once. The apprentice, a boy of perhaps 16 named Thomas Wren, listened to these songs with the same close attention he brought to everything aboard the Caledonia, trying, in his quiet way, to memorize not just the words but the exact moment in the pulling when the voices would rise together, as though the timing itself were a kind of knowledge he needed to acquire. Young Wren had signed aboard only weeks before departure, the son of a shipwright who had hoped, without much success, that his boy might find steadier work ashore. But the sea had claimed him early in the way it claims certain boys. and now he moved about the deck with an eagerness that the older sailors found by turns endearing and exhausting. He was learning the ropes in the most literal sense, the names of each line, the particular knot required for each task, the difference between a line that could bear weight and one that would slip under strain. But he was learning too, in a broader sense, the unspoken customs of shipboard life. How to read the weather in the color of the sky before any instrument confirmed it. How to carry himself so that his inexperience did not become a burden to the men around him. Captain Ross took a quiet interest in the boy's progress, though he rarely addressed him directly, preferring instead to observe from a distance and offer correction through the first mate when correction was needed. It was, Wren would later understand, a kind of teaching particular to men like Ross, patient, indirect, trusting that the sea itself would provide most of the necessary lessons if only the boy paid sufficient attention. The ship's log, kept in Ross's own steady hand, recorded these early days with the same procedural calm that characterized the voyage itself. Position, weather, wind, direction, sail configuration, notable occurrences. The entries followed a template so consistent that reading them in sequence produced an almost hypnotic effect. Day after day of moderate seas and favorable winds, of nothing remarkable to report beyond the ordinary business of sailing a ship south. There is a particular quality to these routine log entries, a flatness of language that gives no indication of what any given day might eventually come to mean. A sailor reading Ross's log from this period would find no foreshadowing, no sense of dread creeping into the careful cursive, only the steady accumulation of latitude and longitude as the Caledonia made her way down the long curve of the Atlantic, past the last outpost of European trade, into waters that grew, with each passing week, progressively less familiar. It is worth pausing here in this quiet stretch of easy sailing to remember what waited far to the south, though the men themselves gave it little thought in these early days, occupied as they were with the immediate pleasures of fair winds and following seas. The Horn, at this point in the voyage, existed only as a word in Ross's charts, a notation of latitude that meant nothing yet in any visceral sense. It would be weeks still before the temperature began its slow, relentless decline, before the day shortened and the swells grew heavier and the crew began to understand, each in his own private way, the particular character of the place toward which they were sailing. For now the Horn remained an abstraction, a problem for a future version of themselves to solve, while the present version enjoyed the last of the tropical warmth and the easy camaraderie of a ship performing exactly as she should. There is a particular cruelty, perhaps, in how gently the sea prepares its ships for disaster, how it offers, in the early stages of any voyage toward genuine danger, such generous and convincing reassurance that all will continue as it has begun. The Caledonia's crew had every reason in these first weeks to believe that their passage south would prove uneventful, that the stories they had heard of the Horn's temper were the exaggerations of men who had faced lesser storms. They could not have known, though perhaps some part of them sensed it, in the way sailors often sense things before instruments confirm them, how thin the membrane was between this present calm and what waited beyond it. The first sign when it came was so subtle that only one man aboard the Caledonia noticed it at all. It was late in the third week, during the middle watch, when the ship's barometer, checked by habit rather than expectation, showed a reading fractionally lower than it had the previous hour. The sailor who noted it, a quiet, unremarkable man named Alfred Boyce, who had served on merchant vessels for the better part of 2 decades, glanced at the instrument, frowned slightly, and made a note in the watch log before returning his attention to the horizon, which showed nothing unusual, no gathering clouds. No change in the wind's steady push from the northeast. It was by any reasonable measure nothing. The kind of minor fluctuation that occurred regularly and meant, more often than not, absolutely nothing at all. Boyce mentioned it to no one. He simply noted it, as procedure required, and continued his watch, unaware that he had just recorded the first faint whisper of something that would, in the weeks ahead, grow into a roar loud enough to test every man aboard the Caledonia, and to claim, before it finished with them, more than any of them yet understood they had to lose. The days that followed folded into one another with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a ship settling into her long southern reach. What had begun as a voyage, measured in familiar terms, leagues travelled, cargo tallied, the comfortable arithmetic of trade, began now to be measured differently, in degrees of latitude crossed, in the fading warmth of a sun that rose later each morning and surrendered the sky earlier each evening. The Caledonia was sailing into winter before her time, chasing the season southward as the season retreated from her, and the crew felt this shift not as a single moment, but as an accumulation, the way a man notices cold only after he has been standing in it long enough to feel it in his bones. The air sharpened first. It came as a subtlety at the edges of the wind, a certain bite that had not been present in the trades, a dryness that stung the lips and left the skin of exposed hands cracked and raw within days. The sea itself seemed to darken in sympathy, losing the easy blue-green translucence of the lower latitudes and taking on a deeper, more serious color, a grey-blue that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it, as though the water itself had begun to understand the gravity of where it was carrying them. Men who had sailed these waters before said little about it, but their silence was its own kind of commentary. The quiet of those who recognized a familiar transition and chose not to name it aloud, as though naming it too soon might hurry its arrival. It was in the evenings that the old stories began to surface, murmured in the close quarters of the forecastle, where the lantern light swayed with the ship's motion and the cold pressed against the hull like something patient and waiting. Sailors who had rounded the Horn before, and there were perhaps 6 or 7 such men scattered through the Caledonia's crew, veterans of earlier voyages who wore their experience quietly, without boast, began to speak of what lay ahead, not as warning exactly, but as a kind of ritual preparation. The passing down of knowledge that had no place in any manual or chart. They spoke of ships that had entered the passage and simply not come out the other side, their names known only from the manifests filed in distant ports, their fates never confirmed, only assumed. They spoke of winds that could tear canvas from the yard in a single gust, of waves that rose higher than any mast, of a cold that could freeze a man's hands to the rigging before he knew enough to let go. One older hand, a weathered Scot named Fenwick, who had made the passage 3 times before and considered himself something of an authority on its moods, told the younger sailors, in the low, matter-of-fact tone of a man relaying practical information rather than spinning a tale, that the Horn did not care for reputation or intention. Ships with the finest captains and the sturdiest hulls had gone down there just the same as vessels barely fit for coastal trade. The sea, at the bottom of the world, he said, made no distinctions. These stories were received with the particular attention that young sailors give to warnings from those who have survived what they themselves have not yet faced, a mixture of skepticism and quiet unease, the desire to dismiss the tale as exaggeration warring with the recognition. Whitfield, still finding his footing in the rhythms of shipboard life, listened to these accounts with the wide, careful attention of someone cataloguing information he suspected he would need later. He asked few questions, but he remembered what he heard, and in the privacy of his own thoughts, he began to understand that the voyage he had signed on to carried a weight he had not fully appreciated when he first walked up the gangplank in London. The physical world around the ship began to change in ways that made these stories feel less like folklore and more like simple description. The albatrosses appeared first, vast white birds with wingspans that seemed impossible for creatures that never appeared to flap. gliding in long, effortless arcs behind the ship's wake, as though the Caledonia's passage through the water created some invisible current of air they alone could read. The old sailors regarded these birds with a respect that bordered on reverence, and more than one man was quietly reminded, though few said so aloud, of the old superstition that held an albatross to carry the soul of a drowned sailor, and that to harm one was to invite the sea's own retribution. No one aboard the Caledonia troubled the birds. They simply watched them day after day, as constant a presence as the ship's own rigging. Then came the ice, not yet close, not yet threatening, but visible now on clear days as pale shapes on the far horizon, drifting fragments of a colder world that had broken loose from wherever such things originated, and now floated south, or perhaps had always been south, waiting. The first sighting caused a stir among the crew, men crowding to the rail to look, though Captain Ross, watching from the quarterdeck, noted in his log only that the bergs remained at a safe distance and posed no immediate concern, adding in the careful, restrained hand that characterized all his entries, that their presence nonetheless confirmed they were now sailing in waters that demanded full attention both day and night. The temperature continued its steady decline, and with it came the small discomforts that accumulate into genuine hardship. Fingers too stiff to properly grip rope, breath-forming clouds that hung in the air before dispersing, the constant dampness that seemed to work its way into every layer of clothing and refused to leave. Men began sleeping in more of their gear than usual, reluctant to strip away even a single layer against the cold that seeps through the ship's timbers at night. The galley fires became a gathering point of unusual popularity, and Cook found himself feeding a crew whose appetites had shifted toward the heavier, warming fare that such conditions demanded. It was against this backdrop of gradual, undeniable transformation that the smaller, stranger signs began to appear, details that meant little in isolation, but that an attentive officer might notice accumulating into something worth watching. Boyce, still conscientious in his duties despite the discomfort of the cold, recorded in his watch notes a peculiar stillness that settled over the water on the morning of what the ship's log marked as their 31st day at sea. The waves, which had maintained a steady working rhythm for days, seemed suddenly to flatten, the surface taking on an odd, glassy quality that felt wrong in a way Boyce could not quite articulate. The wind, too, shifted subtly, not dramatically, not in any way that demanded immediate action, but with a slight backing that took it from its steady northeasterly quarter towards something more variable, more uncertain. Captain Ross noticed these changes as well, and unlike some captains who might have dismissed such subtleties as unworthy of comment, he recorded them with the same careful attention he gave to every other detail of the voyage. His log entries from this period grow slightly longer, slightly more deliberate, as though he were building a case for himself, gathering evidence toward a conclusion he was not yet prepared to state outright. The barometer, he noted on several consecutive days, showed a slow but persistent decline. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have alarmed a less attentive observer, but a steady downward drift that continued day after day with a consistency that troubled him more than any single sharp drop might have done. He ordered without fanfare or announcement that might have alarmed the crew unnecessarily, a series of quiet precautions. The spare canvas was checked and rechecked, torn sailcloth mended ahead of any immediate need, lines were inspected for wear, and those showing the first signs of fraying were replaced rather than left for later attention. Extra lashings were added to the deck cargo, and the ship's boats, always secured, but perhaps not always secured with maximum diligence, were given additional scrutiny by the bosun under the captain's direct instruction. Ross said little to the crew about his reasoning, offering only the terse explanation that they were entering waters where a well-prepared ship was a safer ship. A statement general enough to avoid alarm, while specific enough to ensure compliance. In his private log, away from the eyes of the crew, Ross allowed himself slightly more candor, though even here his prose remained measured, restrained, the writing of a man who distrusted excessive emotion even in the privacy of his own record. He noted the falling barometer, the strange stillness of the water, the shifting wind, and added, in a line that would later be read with particular attention by those who studied the voyage after its conclusion, that he had sailed these waters twice before, had learned to trust small warnings more than large ones, for the sea, in his experience, rarely announced its true intentions with anything so simple as a dramatic gesture. It preferred, he wrote, to whisper first. Whispers continued through the following days, as the Caledonia held her course, the crew going about their duties with the particular quiet attentiveness that comes when men sense, without being told directly, that something significant approaches. Conversations grew shorter, more purposeful. Laughter, when it occurred, seemed to end more abruptly, cut short by some unspoken awareness that levity felt increasingly out of place. Even the ship herself seemed to sense the change, her usual creaks and groans taking on what more than one sailor described as a different character, not louder, not more alarming in any specific way, but somehow more serious, more weighted with implication. It was on the 34th day, with the barometer having continued its slow decline and the sky taking on the particular grey heaviness that the veteran sailors recognized from previous passages, that Captain Ross gave the order that confirmed what everyone aboard had already begun to understand. The Caledonia altered her heading, turning her bow more directly toward the passage that gave the entire region its fearsome reputation, toward the Horn itself, that final promontory where two great oceans met in conflict, where the winds of the roaring forties gathered force and fury before releasing them. The order was given calmly, without ceremony, in the same measured tone Ross used for any routine command. But the crew who executed it did so with a new quality of attention, a heightened watchfulness that had not been present in the earlier, easier days of the voyage. They worked the sails and adjusted the rigging with the particular care of men who sensed, correctly, that the days ahead would demand everything they had to give, and who understood, in the way that sailors always eventually understand, that the sea ahead did not care what they hoped for, only what they could endure. There was a name sailors gave to these waters that no chart ever printed, and it was not spoken lightly. They called it the graveyard, and they called it that not from superstition alone, but from arithmetic, from the long tally of ships that had entered the passage south of the continent and never emerged on the far side to be counted again. Cape Horn sat at the meeting place of two oceans and three great currents, and the water there did not simply move, it collided, folding over itself in patterns no chart could render with honesty. The Drake Passage narrowed the whole circulation of the Southern Ocean into a corridor scarcely 600 miles wide. And through that corridor, the westerlies blew with a consistency found nowhere else on the surface of the earth, unbroken by any landmass, gathering strength across thousands of miles of open water before they struck the Horn and found, at last, something solid to break against. Sailors called that latitude band the furious 50s, and further south still, the screaming 60s, and the names were not poetry. They were reports, filed by men who had lived through the thing being named and wished to warn those who came after. Ross knew the reputation, the way he knew his own name, had known it since he was young enough to sit at his uncle's knee and listen to accounts of the passage that were, even then, already old. He knew the currents converged here with a violence that could turn a following sea into a wall of water in the space of an hour. Knew the westerlies could hold a ship pinned for weeks trying to beat west against them. Knew that more vessels had been lost attempting the Horn than in almost any other stretch of navigable water on the globe. He knew the numbers because every captain who sailed this route learned them as a kind of catechism. How many ships wrecked, how many men drowned, how many simply vanished with no wreckage ever found, to mark where they had gone under. The knowledge did not frighten him in any way that showed. It settled into him instead as a kind of readiness, a bass note beneath his ordinary calm, the accumulated weight of every account he had ever heard, now pressing gently against the back of his attention as he watched the horizon change. Below decks and above, the preparations that had begun as instinct became now deliberate and exhaustive. Every barrel and crate in the hold was checked again, lashings tightened, gaps packed with whatever spare canvas or rope could be spared, because a loose cask in a rolling ship became a weapon, capable of crushing a man against a bulkhead or staving in a hull plank from the inside. The carpenter went from station to station with his mallet and his eye for weakness, testing joints that had held steady through the Atlantic crossing but might not hold through what was coming. Sails were reefed earlier than the wind alone demanded, canvas reduced, not because it was yet necessary, but because Ross wanted margin, wanted the ship already prepared for conditions that had not arrived, rather than caught reducing sail in the middle of a gale with numb hands and failing light. Storm lanterns were filled and trimmed and hung ready at intervals along the deck and below, their glass checked for cracks, their fuel topped so that when darkness came, and it would come regardless of the hour, the storm bringing its own dusk, there would be light enough to see a man's hand in front of him, if not much more. Among the crew, in these hours, the smaller human textures of fear and composure showed themselves in ways that did not appear in any log. The apprentice Young, this being his first passage of the Horn, though he had claimed otherwise to anyone who asked, moved about his duties with a studied steadiness that fooled no one who watched him closely. His hands, when he thought no one was looking, trembled slightly as he coiled a line, and he checked his knots twice where once would have sufficed, not from carelessness in the first tying, but from a need to reassure himself that something at least was secure in a world that suddenly felt provisional. He had heard the stories same as any sailor, had in fact sought them out eagerly enough in port, the way young men often seek out the darker tales of any trade they are about to enter, mistaking foreknowledge for immunity. Now, with the sky beginning to change and the older hands moving with a new economy of motion, he understood that no amount of prior hearing had prepared him for the actual sensation of approach, the way dread settled into the body differently than it settled into the mind. The cook, a broad and weathered man who had crossed this water more times than he cared to count, retreated to his familiar rituals, the small private liturgies that sailors of every era develop and rarely explain even to themselves. He touched the same worn spot on the galley doorframe each time he passed through it, a habit so old the wood had taken a slight polish there from decades of thumbs. He muttered phrases under his breath while he worked, not quite prayers and not quite curses, addressed to no god in particular and to the sea in general, the kind of half-superstitious mutter that accompanies difficult work in dangerous places the world over. He salted the evening stew with a heavier hand than usual, an old belief that heavier food sat better in a stomach that might soon be tested by violent motion, and he made certain, without comment, that there was a warm meal ready and waiting for any man who could still manage to eat one, sensing correctly that it might be the last such meal for some time. In the crew's quarters, in the brief private moments, men could still claim before the watch called them back. Letters were retrieved from sea chests and read once more, then folded and tucked into oilskin pouches, meant to keep paper dry through exactly this kind of weather. A young, able seaman traced his mother's handwriting with a thumb before returning the letter to its wrapping, saying nothing to the man in the bunk beside him, who was engaged in the same silent ritual with a letter of his own. These were not dramatic gestures. No one wept. No one spoke of dying. No one made confessions to shipmates in the manner of stories told later in taverns. The men simply did what sailors have always done before dangerous weather, which was to put their private affections into some form of order, however small, however quiet, so that if the worst came, there would be something already settled, something that did not need attending to in the chaos that might follow. The sky itself began, in these hours, to declare what the currents and the season had already promised. The clouds that gathered along the southern horizon took on a color that experienced sailors recognized immediately, and newer hands learned to fear by watching the reaction of the older ones, a greenish undertone beneath the gray. Say, a bruised quality to the light that had no simple explanation, but that every sailor who had seen it before associated without exception with violence to come. The temperature, which had been merely cold, dropped further within the space of a single watch, sharp enough that breath became visible and exposed skin began to sting from the wind's edge. And the gulls, which had trailed the ship since well before the horn came into consideration at all, drawn by refuse, thrown from the galley, and by whatever instinct draws seabirds to follow vessels through open water, vanished. One watch they were present, wheeling and calling in their ordinary manner. The next watch they were simply gone, and no man aboard remarked on this as coincidence. Sailors had long observed that birds abandoned ships before the worst weather, retreating to whatever shelter their instincts knew existed beyond the horizon, and the empty sky where gulls had been felt, to more than one man on deck, like a door closing. Ross read these signs the way he read a chart, methodically and without alarm, translating each into the language of decision. He had seen the green cast to storm clouds before, had felt sudden temperature drops precede violence on 3 prior crossings of this same latitude, had noted, more than once, the particular silence that followed the departure of seabirds. None of these signs alone constituted proof. Together, accumulating within the space of a single afternoon, they constituted something closer to certainty. And Ross had learned long ago that a captain who waited for certainty before acting had usually waited too long. He gave the order to heave the ship to well before the storm's leading edge reached them, choosing to meet the weather already positioned, rather than caught, making adjustments as it arrived. The maneuver was executed with the same unhurried precision that had marked every command since the coastline of home had dropped below the horizon, sails trimmed to hold the ship steady against the wind rather than driving forward into it, the vessel arranged to ride out what was coming rather than fight through it blind. It was a defensive posture, an acknowledgement that the ship's best chance now lay not in speed or aggression, but in patience, in simply enduring what could not yet be seen, but could already, unmistakably, be felt. That feeling arrived first not as sound, but as sensation, a low vibration carried through the water and up through the hull, into the soles of the feet and the base of the spine. The kind of thing a man senses in his body before his ears confirm it. Somewhere far to the south and west, thunder was rolling across water none of them could yet see, and though the sound itself had not yet reached them, its pressure had, a subtle disturbance moving ahead of the storm, the way the tide moves ahead of the moon. The sea, which had carried its long grey swells with a certain rhythm for days now, began almost imperceptibly to change that rhythm, the intervals between crests growing shorter, the water itself seeming to gather its strength the way a held breath gathers before release. No man aboard could have said precisely when the change began. They only knew, each in his own private way, that something vast was now moving toward them across the water, and that the waiting, which had already stretched for days, was very nearly over. The wind came first, as it always does, arriving not as a single gust, but as a patient pressure that built through the morning watch, until no man could say when stillness had ended and movement had begun. It came out of the northwest in long, testing breaths, each one stronger than the last, each one carrying with it a faint edge of cold that seemed to reach past the wool of the men's coats and settle directly against the skin. The apprentice, standing his watch near the foremast, felt it first as a kind of restlessness in the rigging above him, a low humming in the shrouds that had not been there an hour before. He looked up and saw the topsail trembling at its edges, the canvas rippling in small, quick shudders, and he understood, without being told, that the ship was beginning to speak a different language than the one she had used for weeks. The waves lengthened before they grew tall. This was the first sign that the older hands noted, murmuring it to one another with the particular economy of men who had seen such things before and had no wish to speak of them longer than necessary. The swells which had rolled beneath the ship in slow 6-second intervals for the better part of the voyage now began to stretch themselves across longer spans of water, 10 seconds, then 12, the troughs between them deepening even as their crests remained modest. It was the sea drawing its breath, one boatswain said quietly to the apprentice, though the boy did not fully understand what was meant by this until later, when the breath was released in earnest and the entire ocean seemed to rise at once beneath the hull. The ship's timbers began to groan in a manner distinct from the general creaking that had accompanied every mile of the voyage. This was not the settling sound of a vessel riding easy swells, but something with more strain in it, a low complaint that traveled up through the deck planking and into the soles of the men's boots. The apprentice felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to originate somewhere deep in the ship's spine and radiate outward with each labored rise and fall. He had grown accustomed, over the preceding weeks, to thinking of the ship as something solid and unchanging, a fixed point of safety in an otherwise fluid world. Now, for the first time, he understood that she too was a living thing under strain, her joints and fastenings absorbing punishment that would eventually have to be paid for in wood and iron and the sweat of the men who kept her whole. Captain Ross appeared on deck before the first bell of the watch had fully faded, moving with the unhurried economy that had marked every action the apprentice had observed in him since the voyage began. He did not run. He did not raise his voice beyond what was necessary to carry over the freshening wind. He simply walked the length of the weather deck once, his eyes moving across rigging and canvas, the faces of his men, with the same careful attention he might have given a ledger of accounts, and then he began to give the orders that would prepare the ship for what was coming. "Strike the topgallants," he said, and the words were passed forward before he had finished speaking them. Men, already moving toward the shrouds with the trained haste of those who understood that hesitation now would cost dearly later. The topsails came next, reefed down to storm canvas, with a speed that spoke of long practice, sailors working in pairs along the yards, their bodies leaning into gusts that seemed to grow stronger with each passing quarter hour. The apprentice was sent aloft himself, ordered up into the foretop to assist with the gaskets, and it was there, some 60 feet above the deck, that he first felt something close to true fear. The ship's motion at that height was violent in a way it had never been below. Each roll sent him swinging out over water that seemed impossibly far down, grey and heaving, and utterly indifferent to whether he fell into it or not. Spray had begun to reach even this high, flung upward by waves breaking against the bow, and carried on gusts that seemed determined to peel him from the yard entirely. His hands, wrapped around wet canvas and wetter rope, ached with the effort of holding on, and for one long moment, as the ship rolled further than he expected, and the horizon tilted at an angle that seemed to defy all reason, he was certain he would lose his grip and fall. He did not fall. The training that had been drilled into him during the calmer days of the voyage asserted itself before conscious thought could intervene. His body, finding the familiar holds and bracing itself against the familiar rhythms, even as his mind reeled with something close to panic. He finished securing his portion of the sail with hands that would not entirely stop shaking, and when he finally descended to the deck, he found his legs unsteady beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the ship's motion. Below, the rest of the crew worked with the same disciplined haste. Hatches were battened down and secured with tarpaulins lashed tight against their coamings. Every opening that might admit a following sea sealed against the water that all now understood was coming. Lifelines were rigged along the length of the weather deck, thick ropes strung at waist height from the forecastle to the quarterdeck, so that any man required to cross the open deck in the hours ahead would have something solid to cling to when the ship's motion became more than ordinary balance could withstand. Loose gear was struck below or lashed fast wherever it stood. Barrels and crates and coils of spare rope, all secured against the violence that experience told these men was still to come, though it had not yet fully arrived. Captain Ross moved among them throughout, his voice never rising beyond what was needed, his orders arriving with a steadiness that seemed to calm even as it commanded. He had weathered such storms before. This was clear in every unhurried gesture, in the way he assessed each report brought to him and responded not with alarm but with the next necessary instruction. When the mate reported the barometer's continued fall, the captain merely nodded and asked for the reading to be brought to him at shorter intervals. When a young seaman, newer even than the apprentice, fumbled a knot in his haste and earned a sharp word from the boatswain, the captain intervened only to say quietly that haste without care served no one, and that there was time yet to do the work properly if it was done now. This composure, more than any single order he gave, seemed to steady the crew as the wind continued to build through the afternoon watch. The apprentice found himself watching the captain whenever his own duties permitted, drawing something like courage from the older man's evident calm. It was not that Ross seemed unaware of the danger gathering around them. Rather, he seemed to have made his peace with it long before this particular storm had ever formed, to have accepted the sea's capacity for violence as simply one more condition to be managed rather than feared. This acceptance, communicated through nothing more than posture and tone, passed itself along the length of the ship almost as effectively as any spoken reassurance could have done. The barometer continued its descent through the remaining hours of daylight, each reading lower than the last, until the mate reported a figure that caused even the older hands to exchange glances before returning to their work without comment. The instrument's steady fall matched what every man's own senses now confirmed. The wind had risen from a mere freshening breeze to something that screamed steadily through the rigging, a constant pressure of sound that made ordinary conversation difficult even at close range. The waves had grown, accordingly their crests, now beginning to show white even in the fading light, foam torn from their tops and flung forward in long streaks that the wind carried across the ship's deck like spray from a waterfall. By the time the last grey light of the short afternoon began to fail, the horizon itself had vanished entirely. Where sea had once met sky in a visible line, however hazy, there was now only an advancing wall of cloud, black shading into deeper black, so low and so dense that it seemed to merge with the water itself somewhere beyond the range of sight. This wall was moving toward them. This much was clear even to the apprentice's inexperienced eye, moving with a deliberate and unhurried pace that seemed almost more menacing than sudden violence would have been. It was the visible edge of something the entire ship had been anticipating for days, now arriving at last with the same patient certainty that had marked every stage of its approach. The captain gave his final orders as this wall drew near, his voice carrying clearly despite the wind, sending the last men below who were not required on deck, confirming that all hatches were secured, all lifelines fast, all canvas reduced to the storm rig that experience had taught would serve best in what was coming. The apprentice found himself stationed near the mainmast, lashed to a stanchion, as instructed, his eyes fixed on that advancing darkness, even as his hands gripped the rope that would keep him aboard whatever came next. The wave, when it arrived, gave almost no warning beyond a sudden deepening of the ship's roll and a rising wall of black water visible even against the darker sky behind it. It broke over the bow with a force that seemed to shake the entire vessel from stem to stern, a great mass of green and white water sweeping the length of the forecastle and surging aft with a violence that tore the breath from the apprentice's lungs, even as the lifeline held him fast against the deck. The storm, which had been announcing its arrival for hours through wind and swell and the slow, ominous fall of the glass, had finally and fully begun. What followed was not a single blow, but a succession of them, each wave arriving before the ship had fully recovered from the last, so that she seemed to stagger rather than ride, her great wooden bulk shuddering under impacts that no one aboard could have prepared for, no matter how many years they had spent at sea. The waves themselves had grown beyond anything the younger hands had witnessed, mountains of black water rising higher than the mainyard, their crests torn into streaming white manes by a wind that no longer merely blew but screamed, a continuous shrieking howl through the rigging that made ordinary speech impossible even at close range. Men shouted directly into one another's ears and still had to repeat themselves, their words swallowed whole by the roar of wind through taut cordage, a sound like some vast and furious instrument being played by the storm itself, rising and falling but never ceasing, never granting so much as a moment's pause in which a man might gather his thoughts. The ship rolled with a violence that defied the imagination of those who had not lived through it, eeling so far to leeward that the lower yardarms seemed to brush the foaming water, then swinging back with a sickening lurch that threw men from their feet and sent anything not lashed down careening across the deck. Below, in the darkness of the hold, cargo that had been secured with such care in the calm days before now groaned and shifted against its restraints, the ship's very timbers protesting with long, deep creaks that could be felt through the soles of the feet as much as heard. On deck, the crew fought a battle that had no beginning and no clear end, each man assigned to some task of securing a line, checking a lashing, freeing a block gone foul, all of it performed in conditions that made the simplest action a trial of strength and will. The forecourse, already reefed to its smallest span, threatened constantly to blow free of its gaskets, and twice men were sent out along the yard itself, inching along the foot ropes, with the ship rolling beneath them and the wind trying to pluck them from their precarious perch. It was work that could not be delayed, for a sail torn loose in such wind might destroy itself in minutes and take the mast with it, and so the men went, gripping with hands already numb, their oilskins offering little protection against water that found every seam and gap, running down collars and up sleeves until every man aboard was soaked through to the skin, regardless of what he wore against the weather. The taste of salt was everywhere now, in the mouth, on the lips, stinging in eyes that had long since given up trying to stay dry. It coated the tongue with each gasping breath drawn against the wind, mixed with the metallic tang of exertion, and for some, the faint sourness of nausea barely held in check. Cold was a separate torment entirely, biting through wool that had gone from merely damp to entirely sodden, each garment now serving less to warm the body than to hold the freezing water against the skin. A slow leaching of heat that no amount of movement seemed to counter. Fingers grew clumsy and thick, feet went numb inside boots, already filled with water that sloshed with each roll of the deck, and still the men worked, because to stop working was to invite disaster in 100 different forms. The deck itself had become a treacherous plain of moving water, ankle-deep in places, sometimes knee-deep, as a larger sea came aboard, sweeping from rail to rail with a force that could take a man's legs from beneath him in an instant. Lifelines had been rigged along the length of the ship in the hours before the storm's full arrival. Stout ropes stretched taut from bow to stern, and every man who ventured beyond the shelter of the deckhouse clipped himself to these lines before daring another step. It was to these lines that more than one life would owe its continuance before the night was through, though the lines themselves were tested near to their limits by the violence of the seas that broke aboard. It was during one such sea, larger than most that had come before it, that the ship rolled with such suddenness and depth that a young sailor working near the main shrouds lost his footing entirely, swept from the deck in a boiling rush of white water that carried him toward the rail with a speed that left no time for thought, only reaction. His lifeline, stretched to its full length, caught him at the very edge of the deck, but the strain of the sudden arrest proved too great for the aging rope, and with a crack scarcely audible above the storm's roar, it parted, leaving him for one suspended. Tight, terrible, instant, with nothing between himself and the sea but the receding wash of water already dragging him toward the rail's edge and the black abyss beyond it. What saved him was not fortune alone, but the quick and desperate reach of another crewman, an older hand who had been working nearby, securing a block, and who, seeing the parting of the line even as it happened, threw himself forward without hesitation, catching the younger man by the wrist in a grip that held, despite the wrenching force of the water, still rushing past them both. For a moment that seemed to stretch far beyond its true duration, the two men remained locked together on the very edge of the deck, the sea streaming past them toward the scuppers, the ship still rolling beneath them, until at last the water's rush subsided, enough that other hands could reach them, hauling both men back from the rail and into what passed, eined, in such conditions, for safety. No words were exchanged in that moment that anyone later recorded, only the ragged breathing of two men who understood without speech how narrow the margin had been, how easily the sea might have claimed one of their number in the space of a single unlucky roll. Through all of this, Captain Ross remained at the wheel, or more precisely lashed to it, a length of rope secured about his waist and made fast to the binnacle to prevent his being swept away should a sea come aboard at the stern, as had happened to other ships in other storms with results that needed no elaboration among men who had heard the stories. He had taken the wheel himself hours before, relieving the helmsman when the strain of holding a true course became too great a burden for any one man to bear alone. For long, and he had not left it since, his hands locked upon the spokes with a grip that had long since passed beyond conscious effort, a communion between man and ship that no amount of training could fully explain, but that every sailor recognized when he saw it. The visibility by this hour had been reduced to almost nothing, the driving spray and rain combining with the deepening dark to erase any true sight of the seas before they struck, so that Ross steered as much by feel as by any visual reckoning, sensing through the wheel itself the ship's response to each wave. Anticipating by some accumulated wisdom of decades at sea, the moment when a particular swell would demand a slight correction, a moment's easing, a firm hold against the pull that might otherwise broach the vessel and turn her broadside to the full fury of the storm, an event from which few ships recovered. His face, when it could be glimpsed by the dim light of the binnacle lamp, showed no expression that might be called fear, only a fixed and unwavering concentration, the look of a man who had narrowed the entire world down to the small compass of wheel and ship and sea, admitting no other thought, no other concern. It was said afterward by more than one member of the crew that they had drawn a strange comfort from the sight of him there, soaked and shivering as they all were, and yet utterly unmoved in his purpose, a fixed point around which the chaos of the storm. Whether this was true wisdom on their part, or simply the natural inclination of frightened men to find reassurance where they could, none could say with certainty, but the effect was real enough, and more than one sailor later credited the captain's steadiness with holding the crew's own resolve together through the worst hours of that endless night. And it was in truth endless in feeling, if not in fact, for the storm showed no sign of relenting as the hours passed, each wave seeming to build upon the violence of the last, the wind never easing but rather finding new registers of fury, until it became difficult for any man aboard to remember clearly what calm water had felt like. What silence might mean, whether such things had ever truly existed, or were merely the fading memory of some other life lived by some other version of himself before the Horn had claimed him for its own. It is worth pausing in the telling of such a night to consider how thin the margin truly was between the ship's survival and her destruction, between a life preserved and a life lost to the sea's indifferent hunger. A rope's fraying, a hand's grip loosening by some fraction of a second, a wave arriving moments sooner or later than it did. Any of these might have altered the story entirely, might have added another name to the long list of those the Horn had claimed and never returned. That the Windermere and her crew survived this night owed as much to chance as to skill, though skill and discipline certainly played their part. A truth that every sailor who has faced such a storm understands in his bones long before he can put it into words, if indeed he ever can. The hours that followed offered no such truths, only the raw material from which truths might later be assembled. Hour after hour of darkness, in which the storm showed no inclination toward mercy or resolution, in which the crew of the Windermere endured simply because enduring was the only alternative to the sea claiming them outright. Midnight came and went, unmarked by any bell, for the ship's bell had been lashed silent hours before, its clanging deemed an unnecessary cruelty added to a night already sufficiently unkind. Men worked by feel more than sight, their world reduced to the rope beneath their palms, the decks pitch and roll beneath their boots, the cold that had long since stopped being merely uncomfortable and had become instead a kind of constant companion, present in every breath, every motion. Every thought that managed to form itself, despite the fog of exhaustion settling over their minds. There is a particular quality to cold at such latitudes that those who have not experienced it find difficult to credit, a cold that does not simply chill the skin, but seems to work its way into the bones themselves, into the very marrow, so that a man ceases to feel cold in any localized sense, a walking manifestation of the temperature that surrounds him. The crew of the Windermere had reached this state hours before, their bodies having long since exhausted whatever reserves of warmth they had carried aboard, their clothing soaked through with seawater that seemed to carry with it an additional chill beyond what the thermometer might have measured. As though the Southern Ocean took some particular satisfaction in making its cold felt in the fullest possible measure. Yet they worked still because the alternative to working was not rest, but disaster, and disaster in that place meant not simply the loss of the ship, but the loss of every soul aboard her, a fact that required no articulation among men who had spent their lives at sea and understood its terms without needing them spoken aloud. Ropes were checked and rechecked, hands gripping cordage until palms split and bled, the salt water finding these wounds and making them burn with a particular sharpness that some part of each man's mind registered even through the greater numbness of cold and fatigue. One sailor, whose name the ship's log records only as Hutchins, would later show his hands to a doctor in Valparaiso, who pronounced himself astonished that infection had not claimed several fingers, so deep were the lacerations. So prolonged had been their exposure to salt water and unrelenting strain. Prayer, in such circumstances, becomes less a formal exercise than a kind of murmured accompaniment to labor. Words offered up not in the expectation of miraculous intervention, but simply because the human mind, faced with circumstances beyond its control, seeks some form of address to whatever power might be listening. Acknowledgement that the situation exceeded ordinary human agency. Several of the crew were heard in the brief lulls, when wind allowed voices to carry, murmuring what might have been prayers, or might simply have been the recitation of familiar words that provided comfort through their familiarity alone, psalms half remembered from childhood. What the names of wives and mothers, repeated like talismans against the storm's indifference. Captain Ross made no comment on this, understanding perhaps that a man's private negotiations with fear and faith were his own business. So long as his hands continued their work upon the ropes and his attention remained fixed upon his duties. The ship's cook, a broad Welshman named Price, who had sailed these waters twice before and survived storms nearly as severe, took it upon himself to distribute what warmth he could manage under conditions that made his usual labors nearly impossible. The galley fire, extinguished hours before as a precaution against the ship's violent motion, could not be relit, but Price had thought ahead, had filled every available vessel with hot broth before the storm's full fury made cooking impossible, and now moved among the crew as best he could, offering what remained of this warmth to men whose hands shook too violently to hold a cup steady, feeding some of them directly as one might feed a child or an invalid, an act of tenderness that seemed almost incongruous against the storm's violence, but which several survivors later credited with keeping them upright through the night's worst hours. The broth had long since gone lukewarm, but even lukewarm liquid represented a luxury against the pervasive cold, and Price's rounds through the ship, precarious and dangerous as they were, given the deck's constant movement, provided a small current of human warmth that ran counter to the storm's implacable chill. The ship herself spoke throughout these hours in a language of creaks and groans that experienced sailors could interpret with some precision, though the message they conveyed offered little comfort. The Windermere's timbers, seasoned oak selected for their particular strength, nonetheless protested under the strain being placed upon them, each wave's impact sending a shudder through the entire structure that could be felt in the deck beneath one's feet, in the masts overhead, but in the very air of the ship's interior, where those not required on deck huddled in what shelter they could find. Around 2 in the morning, a sound different from the ship's usual protests cut through the storm's roar. A sharp crack that every sailor aboard recognized immediately as something breaking, something structural giving way under strain it could no longer bear. The mizentop gallant mast, already weakened by the storm's earlier assault, had cracked along its length, not breaking away entirely, but compromised enough that Ross ordered it struck immediately, a dangerous operation conducted in darkness and violent seas that nonetheless proceeded without further injury. The crew's exhaustion, apparently offset by an adrenaline that came from confronting yet another crisis in a night that seemed composed of nothing else. Water had begun finding its way into the hold as well, seeping through seams that had held tight in calmer waters, but which now, under the storm's relentless battering, allowed the sea to intrude in slow but steady volumes. The pumps, manned in shifts by whatever crew could be spared from more immediately critical duties, worked continuously through these hours, their rhythmic clanking providing a strange counterpoint to the storm's chaos, a reminder that even amid such violence, certain mechanical processes continued their steady function. Embodied in iron and wood and the simple mechanics of the pump, offered at least this one reliable defense against the sea's intrusion: pour. The water level in the hold rose slowly despite these efforts, never reaching a point that suggested immediate catastrophe, but never fully receding either. A slow accumulation that added its own quiet anxiety to the night's accumulated burdens. Among all those who labored through these hours, perhaps none faced the night with quite the particular terror experienced by young Thomas Ainsley, the ship's apprentice, whose earlier fear upon witnessing the storm's approach had, by this point, transformed into something both more profound and more controlled. He had been assigned to work alongside more experienced hands on the foredeck, tasks that required him to venture repeatedly into the ship's most exposed positions, clipping and unclipping his safety line as duties demanded, always aware that a single mistake, a single moment of carelessness, might send him over the side into water that would grant no possibility of rescue. His hands, like those of the older sailors, had split and bled from the ropes. Though he made no complaint of this, said nothing of the pain that must have accompanied each grip and pull, each adjustment of canvas or cordage that his duties required. What passed through the boy's mind during these hours can only be reconstructed from fragments, from the brief comments he made years later when recounting the voyage to those who asked, from the terse notation in his own later journal that simply read of that night that he had been afraid beyond any fear he had known before or since, but had found that fear, however overwhelming, did not prevent the body from continuing its work, that some deeper mechanism took over when terror reached its peak, some combination of training and instinct and simple stubbornness that kept his hands moving, kept him gripping ropes that his conscious mind screamed at him to release in favor of some illusory safety that did not, in truth, exist anywhere aboard that ship on that particular night. He would later attribute his survival in part to watching the older sailors around him, to seeing that they too were afraid, that fear was not a mark of weakness, but simply the natural response of any thinking creature to circumstances of genuine peril, and that the measure of a sailor lay not in the absence of fear, but in one's capacity to continue functioning despite it. Captain Ross, for his part, maintained through these hours the outward composure that his position demanded, offering orders in a voice that betrayed nothing of whatever private calculations occupied his mind. Yet his own log, written in the storm's aftermath but reflecting upon these specific hours, contains fragments that suggest a captain far less certain of his ship's survival than his outward bearing indicated. A brief entry, scrawled in handwriting, notably less steady than his usual careful script, reads simply, "Near 2 bells, thought we might lose her. The sea took the ship broadside, longer than I liked, longer than any vessel should endure such treatment. God's mercy alone brought us through that moment. For, I confess, I saw no course of action that might have saved us, had she not righted herself when she did." Such admissions were rare in a captain's log, rarer still from a man of Ross's particular reserve, and they suggest that behind his composed exterior he understood with painful clarity just how narrow was the margin between survival and catastrophe, how thin the thread upon which 40 lives, including his own. It was some time past 4 in the morning by the ship's best reckoning that the first hint of change appeared, not in the storm's violence, which continued unabated, but in the sky itself, where the absolute blackness that had prevailed since the previous evening began, almost imperceptibly, to soften towards something less than complete darkness. This lightning offered no immediate relief, no diminishment in wind or wave, no cessation of the labor that continued to consume every available hand aboard the Windermere. But it offered something perhaps equally valuable in that moment, the simple knowledge that time continued its forward progression. That night, however endless it had seemed through its worst hours, remained subject to the same natural laws that governed all nights. And that dawn, however distant it might yet be, was not an impossibility but an inevitability, a promise written into the very rotation of the earth that no storm, however violent, could ultimately prevent from being fulfilled. The men who worked the pumps, and the men who held the wheel, and the men who clung to the rigging with fingers gone past, feeling did not know in those hours that dawn approached according to any promise. They knew only the wind, which had governed every motion of their bodies for so long that its absence, when it began, seemed at first like a failure of their own senses rather than a change in the actual world. It was Ross who noticed first, or perhaps only Ross, who trusted himself to speak of it. Standing at the binnacle with salt-crusted white in the lines of his face, his eyes fixed not on any instrument, but on the sound itself, the great constant roar that had filled every hollow of the ship for the better part of 2 days. The roar was still there, but somewhere within it, almost too subtle to name, a thread had gone slack. He said nothing to the men near him, not yet. A captain who called false hope into a storm risked more than embarrassment. He risked the particular despair that comes when a promised mercy fails to arrive, when men who have permitted themselves to believe in an ending find the ending withdrawn, and the storm resuming its full weight upon spirits already spent past the point of easy recovery. So Ross kept his counsel and listened, and beneath the listening he began cautiously to hope. The wind did not fall away as it had risen, in sudden gusts and shrieking escalations. It slackened the way a fever breaks unevenly, with relapses that seemed for a moment to erase every gain. A quarter hour would pass in which the shrieking overhead dropped to something merely violent, something a sailor might have called. In gentler waters, a strong gale, no more. And then a fresh assault would come screaming out of the southwest, as though the storm had only paused to gather itself. And the Caledonia would heel and shudder, and every man aboard would feel his heart drop back into the same black well it had occupied for the better part of 2 days. Hope in such conditions became a dangerous commodity, hoarded carefully, spent only when the evidence became difficult to deny. The sea itself gave no such easy comfort. If anything, the waves seemed larger now than they had at the height of the wind's fury. Vast grey mountains that rose without visible cause and broke without warning, as though the ocean's memory of violence outlasted the violence itself, as though the water needed time to forget what the wind had taught it. The ship rode up these slopes with a labouring slowness that spoke of exhaustion. In her very timbers, hung for a moment at each crest, with her bow pointed at a sky still the colour of iron, and then fell, always the falling, that sickening surrender to gravity that no man aboard had learned to anticipate, without his stomach rising into his throat, down into the trough where the wind, for one merciful moment, could not quite reach them, sheltered by walls of water taller than the mainmast. It was in one such trough, when the worst seemed almost credibly behind them, that the sea delivered its final and most vicious lesson in humility. The men had begun, in small ways, to unclench. Hands that had gripped ropes and rails with the fixed desperation of men expecting each moment to be their last had begun, cautiously, to loosen. Someone near the mainmast had allowed himself something close to a laugh, quickly swallowed, at some grim joke about dry stockings that would never again seem an achievable luxury. It was in this fractional relaxation, this first thin easing of vigilance, after 2 days in which vigilance had been the only barrier between the ship and the deep, that the rogue wave came. It did not announce itself as the others had, with the visible rise of water gathering itself against the horizon. It came instead from an angle no one had been watching, a great, confused mass of sea that seemed to erupt rather than roll. Born of the collision of currents still churned by the dying storm, a wave that answered to no pattern the helmsman had learned to read in the 2 days previous. It struck the Caledonia not on her bow where she was built to take such blows, but on her quarter, catching her at the precise moment she was already leaning into the trough, already committed to a roll that the wave now seized and multiplied beyond anything her frame had been asked to survive. The ship went over. Not entirely. She did not capsize, would not capsize, though in the 2 or 3 seconds that followed, no man aboard could have said this with any confidence, but she heeled to an angle that brought her rail beneath the water, and her deck to something closer to a wall than a floor, and every loose object aboard, every man not lashed or braced, became for that instant a falling thing, subject only to gravity and the ship's furious tilt. And Ross, thrown against the binnacle with a force that would leave bruises he would not fully catalogue for days, felt the world reorganize itself around a horizon gone entirely wrong. The grey sky where the grey sea should have been, and in that suspended moment which felt far longer than the physics of it could have allowed. He understood with total clarity that the ship's survival was no longer a matter of skill or preparation, but had become simply a question the sea itself would answer. The Caledonia answered it herself. The end, or her builders answered it for her. The deep keel and the careful ballast, and all the accumulated wisdom of generations of shipwrights who had learned, through the loss of countless vessels before her, what shape a hull must take to fight its way back from such an angle. She hung at the edge of capsizing for a moment that stretched itself thin across the memory of every man who lived to describe it afterward, and then, with a shudder that ran through her entire frame like a physical exhalation, she began to right herself, water sheeting off her deck in the sudden reversal. The horizon swinging back with sickening speed toward its proper place. But the righting itself brought its own danger, for a ship recovering from such a roll does not simply settle back into safety. She can as easily roll past center in the opposite direction, and it was here that the discipline beaten into the crew across 2 days of unrelenting labor proved itself in a manner no drill could have fully rehearsed. Men who had been thrown to the deck scrambled without instruction to the opposite rail, adding what weight and leverage their bodies could offer to check the ship's wild swing. The helmsman, though flung from the wheel entirely, was back at the spokes within seconds, fighting to bring the rudder to bear before the next wave could catch them broadside again. Ross himself, still tasting blood from where he had bitten his tongue in the fall, was shouting orders before he had fully found his feet, his voice cutting through the chaos with the particular authority of a man who has decided, in the space of an instant, that panic is a luxury the moment cannot afford. It took perhaps 2 minutes, though every man who survived it would later describe those minutes as existing in some dimension outside ordinary time, elastic and compressed at once, for the Caledonia to fight her way back to something resembling an even keel. 2 minutes of shouted commands and desperate scrambling of men throwing their weight against rails and rigging with no clear sense of whether their efforts contributed anything at all to a survival that seemed, in truth, to rest largely in the hands of forces far beyond their control. And yet they worked as though their efforts mattered, because the alternative, the surrender to helplessness, the abandonment of the fight, was a door none of them were prepared to open, not after 2 days of proving to themselves and each other that the fight was one they intended to continue for as long as their bodies permitted. When the ship finally settled, riding once more upon an, even if still violent sea, a silence fell across the deck that was different from any silence that had preceded it. It was not the silence of exhaustion, though exhaustion was present in every trembling limb. It was the silence of men who had looked for one clear moment into the specific shape of their own deaths and had somehow been permitted to step back from it. No one spoke for a long moment. Then, gradually, the ordinary sounds of the ship's labor resumed. The pumps, the creak of strained timber, the low exchange of necessary commands, but beneath these sounds ran a current of something that had not been present before the rogue waves struck, a fragile, unspoken awareness that the worst the storm could offer had perhaps already been survived, that whatever remained, however dangerous, was unlikely to exceed what had just been endured. And indeed, in the hour that followed, the wind continued its uneven retreat, the relapses growing shorter and less severe, the intervals of relative calm growing longer, until at last there came a stretch of perhaps 20 minutes in which the gale, though still a gale by any ordinary measure, murderous violence that had defined the storm's peak, the waves remained mountainous, The cold remained absolute, but the wind that drove both had lost its worst edge, had become something the Caledonia could reasonably be expected to survive, rather than something that seemed determined to prevent her survival by any means available to it. Ross, standing once more at the binnacle with his hands finally steady enough to grip the rail without visible tremor, allowed himself, for perhaps 3 seconds, an expression his officers had not seen cross his face since before the storm's first warning signs had appeared on the horizon days earlier, something that might, in gentler company, have been called relief. The quiet loosening of a jaw held clenched for so long that its release felt almost like pain. It passed as quickly as it had come. He straightened, cleared his throat, and turned to give the next order in the same flat, measured tone he had maintained throughout the ordeal, because a captain's face, he understood better than any man aboard, was itself an instrument the crew read as carefully as any compass, and it was not yet time, would not be time, for some hours yet, to let that instrument speak of anything but the steady, unbroken confidence a crew required to finish what the storm had begun. The dawn that finally came was not the golden dawn of calmer latitudes, but a grey, reluctant lightning, as though the sky itself was uncertain whether the night had truly ended or merely paused to gather strength for another assault. It arrived slowly over the Caledonia, seeping first into the eastern edge of the clouds, then spreading in pale bands across a sea, still heaving with the memory of the storm, though the wind had dropped to something a sailor might almost call gentle by comparison to what had come before. In that thin light, the ship revealed herself fully, for the first time since the gale had taken her, and what she showed was a vessel that had survived only in the way a man survives a long illness, alive, but marked in every visible particular by what she had endured. The foremast stood, but barely, its upper section splintered where the topgallant had carried away sometime in the deepest part of the night, the wound in the wood pale and raw against the weathered grey of the timber below. Rigging hung in disordered loops and trailing ends, some of it slack, some drawn so taut it seemed likely to part at the first fresh gust, and here and there a line simply ended in nothing, whipped apart by forces the crew had felt but not fully witnessed in the darkness. The sails that remained bent to the yards were shredded in places, torn along their seams, patched by the storm itself into strange new shapes that no sailmaker would have designed, and 2 had vanished entirely, torn free and carried off into the black hours to fall wherever the wind saw fit to drop them, perhaps into the sea, perhaps not, no man could say. The deck itself bore its own record of the night. Boards were sprung along one section near the waist, lifted slightly from their fastenings by the pounding of a sea that had come aboard again and again, and a portion of the starboard bulwark was simply gone, torn away as though some vast hand had reached down, leaving a raw gap through which the men could look directly out onto the water that had so nearly clung to them. Coils of rope lay tangled and salt-stiffened in corners, mixed with splinters of wood, a shattered water cask, the remains of what had once been a ship's boat, now reduced to a few broken staves, lashed uselessly to davits that themselves hung askew. The galley stove had been extinguished for 2 full days, and would remain so a while longer, for the fire had been doused by seas coming down the companionway, and no one had yet found the strength or the dry fuel to relight it. Captain Ross moved through this wreckage of his ship in the pale early light, with the same careful, unhurried attention he had given every hour of the storm, noting each fracture and failure, not with despair, but with the practical eye of a man who had spent his life understanding what wood and rope and canvas could endure, and what they could not. He did not speak much as he walked her decks that first morning. He touched the splintered mast with one hand, tested a length of rigging with a tug that told him more than any glance could, and paused longest at the gap in the bulwark, looking out through it at the grey water beyond, as though measuring in his own mind exactly how close that opening had come to being wider, and what it would have meant if it had been. The men, for their part, had reached the far side of exhaustion, where the body simply stops responding to the demands placed upon it. Many of them, once released from their stations, did not seek their berths, but merely sank down wherever they stood, against a coil of rope beneath the shelter of the quarterdeck, in the lee of whatever solid thing remained standing, and slept there in the open air, salt-crusted and soaked through. Faces slack, with a fatigue that went beyond mere tiredness into something closer to a temporary suspension of the self. No one woke them. There was for the moment nothing more urgent than sleep, and Ross, seeing this, gave orders that the necessary work of the ship be done by the few who could still stand, while the rest were left where they had fallen, wrapped where possible in whatever dry canvas could be found, for even sleep given in mercy. It was some hours into that grey morning, once the worst of the immediate repairs had been assessed and a semblance of order restored to the deck, that the ship's officers turned to the harder task that could not be postponed indefinitely, the accounting of who remained and who did not. This was done quietly, without ceremony, in the manner such things were always done aboard a ship that had suffered loss. The mate, moving along the deck and below with the ship's book in hand, calling names in a voice pitched low, but carrying and marking against each the simple word "present," or the silence that meant something else entirely. Most names were answered. Voices came back hoarse, cracked, some barely audible, but present all the same, and each answer was received without visible reaction, for the mate's task was not to mourn, but to record, and mourning, if it came, would come later and elsewhere. But 3 names went unanswered that morning, and the silence following each was allowed to stand for exactly as long as required before the mate moved on, for there was no purpose served in calling twice into a silence that would not change. A young topman, not yet 20, lost from the yard sometime in the deepest hours of the night, seen briefly against the sky by a shipmate, before the darkness and the spray closed over the place where he had been. A second man, older, a rigger of long experience, gone overboard when a sea broke across the waist and the line he had trusted did not hold. A third, the ship's carpenter, taken not by the sea directly but by a fall against the deck during the worst of the ship's convulsions. His injuries such that he had lingered only a few hours into the night before going quiet in a manner the surgeon, such as the ship possessed in the person of the mate, with some rudimentary training, recognized and could not remedy. 3 men. Out of a crew that had numbered perhaps 80 when the Caledonia first stood south from the calmer waters north of the Horn, 3 men now would not answer any roll call again, and the number, spoken aloud in the mate's low voice and confirmed by the captain with a single nod, settled over the ship, not as a shock, for every man aboard had half expected the count to be worse, but as a grief made almost unbearably plain by its plainness. 3 names where there had been 3 men, and now simply 3 absences where the names still remained. What followed was performed with the restraint that such things demanded at sea, where elaborate ceremony was a luxury the working of the ship could not always afford, but where the loss of a shipmate was never allowed to pass entirely without acknowledgement. The surviving crew gathered as many as could be spared from the ship's continuing needs, gathering near the rail where the gap in the bulwark still gaped open to the sea, and Captain Ross, bareheaded despite the cold, spoke a few words that were not lengthy, not eloquent in the manner of a churchman, but were sincere in the manner of a man who had commanded these 3 individuals, and felt their loss as a captain feels the loss of any part of the instrument he depends upon to bring a ship safely home. He spoke their names. He spoke of duty done, the sea's old claim upon those who served her, of a hope offered without excessive certainty that they had passed quickly and without prolonged suffering. And then, because there was little more that could be said, and much work still waiting, the small gathering dispersed back to their tasks, each man carrying the moment privately, in whatever manner his own nature allowed. That evening, in the relative calm of his cabin, lit by a single swinging lamp and with the ship's motion settled now to something almost gentle by comparison to the nights before, Captain Ross opened his log and made the entry that duty required of him. He wrote plainly without ornament, in the manner such entries were always written, the date, the ship's position, as best it could be reckoned after days, without clear observation, the extent of damage to masts, sails, and rigging noted in the economical language of a working seaman, and then in the same unadorned hand, the names of the 3 men lost. The manner of their loss, as far as it could be determined, and a brief notation of the ceremony performed. At sea, he did not write of his own feeling in the matter. That was not the purpose of a log, and Ross was not a man given to recording sentiment where fact would serve. But something of what he felt was present nonetheless, in the careful plainness of the entry itself, in the fact that he took the time to record each name correctly and completely, in the fullness with which he set down what had been lost, so that it would not be forgotten or diminished by the passage of years. The narrator, considering this entry across the distance of history, finds in its very plainness something worth pausing over. For the Caledonia had survived to write such an entry at all, had survived to count her cost, however painful that counting proved, and to carry her account of it forward into the record that history would later read. How many ships before her, bound for the same waters, meeting the same storms, had simply vanished into the Horn's grey immensity, without leaving even this much behind. No log, no roll call, no names set down in a careful hand. Only a silence at the point of expected arrival, and a slow, uncertain conclusion, drawn by those who waited in port, that somewhere beyond the reach of any account, the sea had taken all of it, ship and crew and story alike, into a keeping from which no entry would ever be written. The Caledonia moved north like something learning to walk again. Her foremast was gone, sheared away in the worst of it, and what remained above her deck was a makeshift arrangement of spars and canvas that Captain Ross and his mates had lashed together in the grey hours after the storm's turning, working with numbed hands and a patience that came less from skill than from necessity. There was no other way forward. Ship would sail on what could be salvaged, or she would not sail at all, and so the carpenter and 2 of the able seamen had gone about the business of fashioning a jury rig from broken timber and spare canvas, working in shifts through the cold, working past the point where their fingers could properly feel the tools they held, because the alternative was to drift, and drifting in those waters was its own kind of death, slower perhaps, but no less certain. The repairs were never meant to be permanent. Everyone aboard understood this, from Ross down to the youngest hand, a boy of perhaps 16, who had signed on in Liverpool with no notion of what the Horn could do to a ship or to the men who sailed her past it. The jury-rigged foremast would hold, if the weather allowed it to hold, long enough to bring the Caledonia into calmer waters, into a latitude where a proper harbour might be found and proper repairs made. This was the extent of the ambition now. Not speed, not schedule, not the demands of cargo or owners waiting in Liverpool for their ship and her hold full of goods. Only this, to move the vessel northward, away from the grip of the Horn, one cautious mile at a time, trusting the wind to be merciful in a way it had not been merciful before. Ross kept the ship close to the wind but never pressed her. He had learned, in the space of that single storm, a caution that no amount of prior experience had taught him. He had rounded the Horn twice before this voyage, both times without incident beyond the ordinary difficulty the passage always presented, and he had come to think of himself privately as a man who understood these waters, who could read their moods well enough to anticipate the worst of them. The storm had corrected this understanding thoroughly. He gave the sea a wider berth now, in every sense the word allowed. He watched the barometer with a frequency bordering on obsession, and when the glass so much as trembled, he was on deck within the minute, scanning the horizon for any sign of what had come before returning to claim what remained of his ship. The crew, for their part, had changed in ways that were not immediately visible, but were nonetheless present in every small exchange, every shared task, every silence that settled over the deck in the hours when there was nothing that needed saying. They were quieter now. The rough humor that had marked the early days of the voyage, the small jokes and complaints that passed between men doing hard, repetitive work, had gone missing somewhere in the storm and had not yet returned. In its place was something more careful, more deliberate, a way of moving about the ship that suggested each man was aware, in a manner he had not been aware before, of how narrow the margin had been between the deck he stood on and the water that had so nearly claimed it. They spoke of the sea differently too, when they spoke of it at all. Before the storm, the ocean had been a thing to be worked, a surface to be crossed, an obstacle with moods but no true will of its own. After the storm, there was a reverence in how they referred to it, a carefulness in their language that bordered on superstition, though none of them would have called it that. Old Tomlin, the boatswain, who had sailed for 30 years and claimed to have seen every kind of weather the world had to offer, took to touching the rail each morning before his watch began, a small gesture, wordless, that no one remarked upon because everyone understood it without needing an explanation. The sea had shown them something of its true nature, and men who have seen such a thing do not forget it easily, nor do they return to treating the water with the casual familiarity they once allowed themselves. What bound them together now was not the easy camaraderie of shared labor, but something deeper and less easily named. The particular closeness that comes only from having stood together at the edge of an ending, and having been, by whatever combination of skill and fortune, allowed to step back from it. They had watched each other in the worst of the storm, had seen each other afraid in a way that stripped away whatever pretense a man might ordinarily maintain, and this seeing had created between them a kind of trust that no ordinary voyage could have produced. They did not speak of this either. It simply was, present in the way they worked together, now in the wordless coordination that had replaced the shouted instructions of before, in the manner one man would reach to steady another without being asked, without either of them remarking on the gesture once it was done. This transformation, this quiet reverence born of survival, was not unique to the Caledonia or to Ross's crew. It was in fact one of the defining characteristics of what came to be known among sailors of the era as a Cape Horner, a term that carried within it both a literal designation and a kind of unspoken honor. To have rounded the Horn was one thing. To have rounded it in genuine storm, to have faced the full weight of what those waters could produce and to have come through it was another thing entirely, and the men who could claim this distinction carried themselves differently in the ports where sailors gathered and told their stories. There was no boasting in it, not typically. The true Cape Horners, the ones who had actually seen the worst of it, tended toward the same quietness that had settled over Ross's crew, a recognition that what they had survived was not a triumph to be celebrated so much as an ordeal to be respected, and that loud claims about it diminished something true and important in the telling. The Horn's reputation, built across centuries of such passages, rested on exactly this accumulation of individual storms, individual crews, individual ships that had gone through the same grey violence and had either returned transformed. Every captain who brought his vessel around that point of land added in some small way to the collective understanding of what the passage demanded and what it was willing to take in exchange for safe crossing. The stories accumulated in the taverns of Liverpool and Cardiff and San Francisco, in the logbooks kept aboard ships that made the passage regularly, in the quiet conversations between men who recognized in each other the particular look of someone who had faced that specific water. Cape Horn was not merely a geographic point to be rounded. It had become, by the time of Ross's voyage, something closer to a trial that separated the merely experienced from those who had been properly tested, and the ships and crews who survived its worst moods carried the mark of this testing in ways both visible and invisible. It was this accumulation of testimony, logbooks, survivor accounts, the careful notations of insurance assessors who priced the risk of horn passages into every policy they wrote, that would eventually preserve the memory of voyages like the Caledonia's within the larger maritime record. Ross kept his log with the same discipline he had maintained throughout the crossing, recording not just position and weather but something closer to a narrative of what had happened. Understanding perhaps that this account would matter to someone beyond himself, whether an owner assessing the condition of his vessel or in some more distant future. A historian attempting to reconstruct what such passages had actually entailed. The insurance underwriters in Lloyd's would eventually receive their own report, dry and formal in its language, but nonetheless a record of loss and survival, of damage sustained and repairs made, of a ship that had gone into the Horn's grip and had, against considerable odds. These documents, unglamorous as they were, would become part of the permanent record from which later generations could understand what the Horn had truly meant for the men who sailed past it in the age of sail. The Caledonia's passage north continued in this manner for many days, the jury-rigged foremast holding through weather that grew steadily milder as they climbed away from the Horn's particular latitude, the crew maintaining their careful, subdued rhythm of work and rest until at last the coast of home came into view and the ship made her way, slow and battered but intact, into the harbour from which she had departed so many months before. There was no grand reception waiting for her. This was, perhaps, the strangest part of the return. How ordinary it appeared to those who watched from the docks, how little the scene resembled what the crew themselves knew had been endured to bring the ship this far. A few families gathered at the waterside, having received word that the Caledonia had been sighted approaching, and there were embraces exchanged in the quiet way that dockside reunions typically unfolded. Wives finding husbands, a handful of children finding fathers they had not seen in the better part of a year. There was relief in these reunions, certainly, but it was a quiet relief, undramatic in its outward expression, the relief of ordinary people relieved by an ordinary homecoming, unaware that this particular return had been, for a period of hours somewhere south of the world's most feared point of land, genuinely uncertain. Ross himself stepped ashore with the same measured calm he had maintained throughout the voyage's final stretch, greeting the ship's owners with a factual account of the damage sustained and the cargo's condition, offering no embellishment, no dramatic recounting of what the crew had faced. It was not modesty exactly, or not only modesty. It was perhaps a recognition that words available to him were insufficient to the actual experience, and that any attempt to convey it fully to those who had not been aboard would fall short in ways that made the attempt itself feel somehow false. Better to speak of timbers and canvas and the practical business of repair than to try to explain what the deck had felt like beneath their feet in the worst hour of the storm, or what it had meant to watch the wave rise above them, and to understand in that moment that survival was no longer within their own control. The crew dispersed into the ordinary business of a return, wages settled, belongings gathered, the small transactions of a voyage's end conducted with the same unremarkable practicality that attended every ship's arrival in every port. And yet, something had passed between these men in those hours off the Horn that would remain with each of them long after the details of cargo and wages and the specific date of departure had faded into the general blur of a life spent at sea. They walked away from the Caledonia that day changed in ways that no onlooker could have detected, carrying within them a knowledge of the water's true capacity that would color every subsequent voyage, every future crossing of those same dangerous latitudes, for as long as any of them continued to sail. There is a name sailors have given to the waters below, the 56th parallel, spoken in the same hushed register reserved for old cemeteries and battlefields, long grown quiet. They call it the graveyard, though no stone marks any grave there, and the sea keeps no record of the ships it has taken, except in the slow accumulation of timber and iron settling into darkness on the ocean floor. Cape Horn does not announce itself as a place of death. It simply exists, that grey wedge of rock at the bottom of the world, indifferent to the ships that pass and the ships that do not, and it has gone on existing in that same indifferent way for longer than any human memory can properly account for. The Caledonia was one ship among an uncountable number that had tested themselves against those waters, and she was fortunate in the end in ways that many others were not. But the Horn does not distinguish between the fortunate and the unfortunate while the storm is happening. It offers no signal, no explanation, no promise of survival or destruction. It simply is what it is, a confluence of wind and current and cold that has been grinding against the hulls of ships since long before anyone thought to give it a name, and it will go on doing so long after the last sailing ship that ever attempted its passage has been forgotten entirely. Captain Ross did not speak often in his later years of what had happened during those hours off the Horn. This was not unusual among men of his profession and his generation. The sea demanded a certain economy of language from those who served it, a reluctance to dwell upon danger once danger had passed, as though naming the fear too precisely might somehow invite its return. He continued to command ships for a number of years afterward, though the records grow thinner as one moves further from that particular voyage, the way records always do, the documentation of an ordinary life being so much sparser than the documentation of an extraordinary few hours. There are notations in shipping registries, dates of arrival and departure, the names of vessels he commanded after the Caledonia, small fragments that together suggest a career that continued along its expected course, weathering the ordinary difficulties of a life at sea without another storm quite so severe. He was, by all surviving accounts, a careful man for the remainder of his career, perhaps more careful than he had been before, though it is impossible to know with certainty whether this carefulness arose from what he had witnessed off the Horn, or whether it was simply the accumulated caution of age settling naturally upon him, as it settles upon most men who spend their lives making decisions upon which other lives depend. His log survived, which is itself a small kind of grace, given how easily such things are lost to fire and water and simple neglect over the passing decades. It found its way eventually into an archive, one of those quiet institutional repositories where the ordinary paperwork of vanished lives is preserved without particular ceremony, filed alongside 1,000 other logs from 1,000 other voyages, most of which no one will ever read again. Within its pages, the storm off the Horn occupies perhaps 3 or 4 entries, written in the same clipped, functional prose that fills the rest of the volume, describing wind speeds and sail configurations and the position of the ship as best it could be calculated under such conditions. There is no dramatic flourish in these entries, no attempt to convey to some imagined future reader the full weight of what the crew had endured. This was not the purpose of a captain's log. It existed to record facts, not feelings, and Ross had recorded the facts with the same steady hand he might have used to describe a calm crossing of the equator. And yet within that very restraint, that refusal to embellish, there is something that speaks more clearly than embellishment ever could. A man who has just survived what Ross and his crew survived does not need to elaborate upon the danger. The plain recitation of wind and wave, and the ship's slow, agonized progress through the worst of it, carries its own weight if one knows how to read between the careful lines of a working sailor's prose. His name appears elsewhere in the maritime records of his era too, though briefly, as most names do, a mention in a shipping company's ledger, a reference in a newspaper account of arrivals at a distant port, the kind of scattered, incomplete trail that most lives leave behind them, especially lives lived largely at sea, far from the institutions that might have preserved a fuller account. He was not a famous captain. He commanded no vessel that entered the history books for reasons beyond this one storm, and even this storm was recorded more fully in the private memory of those who survived it than in any public account of the era. This is, in truth, the fate of most who go to sea. They pass through history, leaving only the faintest of impressions, a name in a ledger, a mention in a log, a brief notation that someone once commanded a ship and brought it safely home. Whatever else Ross accomplished in the remaining years of his career, whatever other storms he weathered or calm passages he oversaw, the record grows quiet, and eventually it stops altogether, as all such records eventually must. He was, in this way, entirely representative of the thousands upon thousands of sailors who attempted the passage around the Horn during the long centuries when that route remained the primary path between the oceans of the world. Most of these men left behind even less than Ross did. Their names survive, if they survive at all, in crew manifests and parish records, and the occasional letter sent home to a family that may or may not have received it before news of a different kind arrived instead. The sea took a great many of them in those years, and it took them in ways that varied enormously in their particulars, but shared a common outcome. Some ships simply vanished, their disappearance noted only by their failure to arrive at an expected port, their fate never established with any certainty, their crews existing forever afterward in a kind of terrible ambiguity, neither confirmed dead nor confirmed alive, simply gone. Others were lost, more visibly wrecked upon the rocks that lined that dangerous coast, their remains discovered eventually by ships that came after, if they were discovered at all. And a great many more survived storms, very much like the one that had nearly claimed the Caledonia, storms that came close enough to disaster that only the narrowest of margins separated triumph from tragedy, though these survivals rarely made their way into any historical account at all, being simply the private knowledge of the men who lived through them, had dark carried silently for the remainder of their lives and then lost entirely when those lives came to their own quiet ends. This is the accounting that Cape Horn keeps, if it can be said to keep any accounting at all. Not a ledger of names and dates, not a monument or a marker, but simply the ongoing fact of the water itself, rolling now in the same patterns it rolled in when the Caledonia passed through, rolling in the same patterns it will roll in long after every ship that has ever attempted that passage has been forgotten by every person who might have remembered it. The sea does not commemorate. It simply continues, wave following wave, in an endless succession that predates the earliest sailing ships and will outlast whatever vessels eventually replace them, should the age of shipping itself someday come to an end. There is something almost merciful in this indifference, though it does not feel merciful to those caught within a storm's fury. The sea does not hold grudges against the ships it destroys, nor does it celebrate the ships it allows to pass. It simply is, in its vast and patient way, entirely unconcerned with the ambitions or the fears of the small wooden vessels that have, for a few centuries now, dared to cross its surface in pursuit of trade and discovery and the simple economic necessities that drove so much of that dangerous commerce. And perhaps this is the final, quiet lesson that the Horn offers to anyone willing to sit with its history for a while, turning over these old accounts of storms survived and storms not survived, of captains remembered briefly and then forgotten, of ships that arrived and ships that never did. Human ambition sent those vessels southward again and again in pursuit of goods and profit and the simple necessity of connecting one part of the world to another. The ocean received that ambition with total indifference, neither rewarding nor punishing it according to any principle a person might recognize as justice. And yet, within that indifference, there is a strange and enduring peace to be found for those who survived. The Caledonia's crew walked away from their storm carrying something that could not be taken from them again, a knowledge of their own capacity to endure what had seemed, in the depths of that long night, entirely beyond enduring. That knowledge outlasted the ship itself, outlasted the captain's career, outlasted even the fading ink of the log that recorded it. It settled into each of them quietly, the way the sea settles after a storm has passed, rolling on in long, slow swells towards some horizon none of them could yet see. Calm now, patient now, keeping its silence as it always had and always would. If this quiet history of survival and endurance has been good company for you tonight, you are welcome to return for more lost voyages, whenever rest is what you are seeking. Sleep well.